It is now November, and that means it is time for our annual Locked On Zags bold predictions.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Friday, happy November, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to provide news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, place your first $5 bet, and you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, it is a tradition here on the Locked On Zags podcast. This is our fourth annual Bold Predictions episode, getting you ready for the start of the college basketball season. This is also the final episode before the season officially begins. Of course, we will have a preview episode on Monday, getting you ready for that evening game against the Baylor Bears on the first day of the season. And then after that, we are all the way in it. So excited for basketball to be back, but very excited for these bold predictions. One of my favorite episodes every single year. Don't usually get these right. I'm going to just say that off the top. I try to make my bold predictions very bold. I had a former editor of mine at a previous place that I used to write that said, if you do bold predictions, your goal should be less than 10% of them correct. If you're getting too many right, then you're not going bold enough. Now, I am quite proud of the fact that a few years ago, I predicted Julian Strawther to score the first 40-point game for Gonzaga in close to a decade, and he did, in fact, do that. I think that might be the only one I've gotten fully correct up to this point. There's a few others where we got it partially correct. We'll see what it looks like this year, but I got three really fun ones. If any of these end up coming together, particularly the last one, excited to get to that one, we're going to be in for an incredible season of Gonzaga basketball. We start with the man, the straw that stirs the drink, the man leading the whole thing, Ryan Nembhard. Prediction number one for me this year is that Ryan Nembhard will lead the country in both total assists as well as assists per game. Start with the background. Last year, Ryan Nembhard had 243 assists on the season. For the record, that was the most single-season assists in Gonzaga basketball history. I'm projecting he will shatter that record and have the top two most prolific passing seasons in Gonzaga history. But his 243 assists was sixth in the entire country, and his 6.9 assists per game was seventh in the country. So he was right around the top five in both categories last year. And in terms of total assists, again, he had 243. Tristan Newton, UConn's point guard last year, had 248, and he was second. So Ryan Nembhard was one game away, barely, one half a game, the way he was playing at the end of the year, away from being in second place. Now, first place last year was Braden Smith, the point guard at Purdue, who had 292, way more than everybody else. To be nearly 50 assists ahead of second place in the country is ridiculous. Huge shout out to Braden Smith for those numbers. But we also know that a big part of Braden Smith's assist totals last year were due to the 7.5-foot monster in the front court in Zach Edey. He's no longer there. Doesn't mean Braden Smith's not going to still rack up assists and be a good passer, but he doesn't have his top offensive option to toss the ball to. And beyond that, Purdue's going to ask Braden Smith to score a lot more points. We don't want to take exhibition results too seriously, but in Purdue's exhibition game against Creighton, they lost. They scored 87 points, so they looked very good offensively, but Braden Smith had 31 of them. I think he's going to be a prolific scorer this year, but I don't know that he's going to put up that level of assist volume simply because he's going to be asked to shoulder a bigger scoring load. Nembhard was 6.9 assists per game. Again, that was seventh. The leader in that category was Tyler Kolek at Marquette, 7.7 per game. He's gone. Next up, Smith was tied for second at 7.5. Elijah Hawkins was at 7.5. Devin Smith at Utah was at 7.1. There was a couple other mid-major guys in there as well, most of them who have graduated and moved on. So not a ton of competition remaining in front of him. Again, we already talked about Braden Smith. Hawkins and Devin Smith both transferred. Hawkins goes to Texas Tech from being at Minnesota. Devin Smith goes from Utah to St. John's. Hawkins is going to a slower paced offense, which I think will limit his ability to rack up assists. And Smith goes to a St. John's team where Kadari Richmond is probably going to have the ball in his hands a lot. So I don't think either of them will be back in that conversation. For Nembhard, the reasons why he can be in this conversation, why he can increase the totals from last year and be the number one in both assists, total assists and assists per game, is basically that the same storyline we've talked about all offseason long with multiple players on Gonzaga's roster. What he did in the second half and really the second 2/3 of last season points to what kind of player he could potentially be over a full season in this system. It took him a little time to get comfortable in Gonzaga's offense. And it wasn't just him. It took Graham Ike a little time. They were, kind of slow to introduce him to playing a full slate just because he was coming off of that foot injury. So it took Nembhard and Ike a little bit of time to find each other. It took Anton Watson a little time to find his role as more of an offensive player. Hickman was adjusting to playing off the ball. You obviously had the loss of Steele Venters right before the season, Dusty Stromer in the starting lineup, the flip in the middle of the season to have Ben Gregg start, et cetera, et cetera. We all know the situation last year and how much this team took off in the final stretch of the game. In the final 23 games for Ryan Nembhard's first season in Spokane, he averaged 7.7 assists per game. That right there, that ties Tyler Kolek. So he did it for 23 games last year. His total assists per game was what Tyler Kolek put up at the top. In the final 12 games of Ryan Nembhard's first season in Spokane, he averaged 9.2 assists per game. He went crazy distributing the basketball at elite level. 9.2 assists per game. Doing that over a full season is obscene. That would be absolutely ridiculous. I'm not projecting him to get up to over 9 per game, but the fact that he did it for a 12-game stretch, when 2 of those games were against the slowest paced team in the country in St. Mary's, or one of the slowest paced teams, to do that is absurd. It's insane to be able to put up that level of efficiency, that level. I mean, you only have in those 12 games, 2.6 turnovers, 9.2 assists and 2.6 turnovers. Just ridiculous amounts of ball distribution skills for Ryan Nembhard. And now you're coming into a year where 7 of your 8 rotation players from last year are back. That early season angst, those early season struggles where you're adjusting to your new teammates, that's not going to be as big of an issue. You add 2 guys who are veterans, who have played a lot of college basketball in Michael Ajayi and Caleb Battle. You keep Nolan Hickman in the same role. You keep Graham Ike in the same role. You keep Ben Gregg in the same role. Dusty Stromer, Braden Huff, those guys are in the same role. And you add 2 players who can space the floor, who can get to the rim, who are both buckets, both guys who averaged over 14 points per game last year. And on top of all of that, Ryan's going to continue to play 35 minutes a game. If you were adding a bunch of players and now you're like, okay, he's going to go from 35 to 28 minutes a game, now it's going to be a lot harder, particularly for him to get to those totals. Much harder to get to a total number of assists if you're playing less. I mean, it's both categories are tougher to get to if he's playing less minutes. But the fact of the matter is Ryan Nembhard is probably still going to play 35 minutes per game on a team where he's comfortable with his teammates, where the depth on the roster is better, where the offensive firepower is better, and on a team where he already averaged 9 assists per game in his final 12 games and 7.7 in his final 23 games. There is a lot of reason to believe that Ryan Nembhard can be the country's best passer this upcoming season. It's possible that he can average 8 assists per game. That is my extra spicy bold take out of this take, is that he averages 8 per game. Again, Kolek led the country at 7.7. I think he's very likely to be at 7.5. I think if he's going to lead the country in assists per game, it's going to have to be 7.5 or higher in order to be the leader in that category. 260, 270 total assists feels very realistic for Ryan Nembhard this year. And I think we're going to look back on this as being one of the best, if not the best passing season in Gonzaga basketball history. And when you consider the point guards that have come through this system, including, the all-time leading passer in NBA history in John Stockton, for Nembhard to likely or potentially be the first and second all-time single-season record holder in assists in Gonzaga history is a tremendous accomplishment. Well, one of the knocks that folks have had about this roster coming into the season is the lack of NBA talent, quote unquote. That's not something I'm buying, and I'm going to tell you why coming up here in just a second. But first, our friends over at 5 Hour Energy know that being a passionate fan is not just a hobby, it's a way of life. And it takes a lot of energy to power through all-day pregame parties, post-game celebrations, or even an agonizing second overtime. That's why they've created the Stand the Fan 5-hour energy shot with a special flavor called Fan Fuel, the energy shot made for super fans like us. The fans who are the first in the kennel, who are the last to leave. We see you. And we know what's giving us Zag fans feel this week. It's an opening night matchup against the Baylor Bears. So tonight, you're going to be super excited, super energetic, and you're going to need that 5-hour energy because that thing doesn't tip off until 8:30 p.m. Pacific time. Folks, 5-hour energy knows that no matter what team you root for, being a fan requires heart, soul, and a whole lot of energy. Whether you're prepping for the big tailgate or ironing your jersey, your game day to-do list is a mile long, and that's why the limited edition Stand the Fan 5-hour energy shot is here to help keep you fueled throughout the season. What's your fan fuel this week? Whatever it is, do it with a 5-hour energy. Available on 5hourenergy.com and shipped nationwide. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still celebrating the calendar flipping to November by doing our bold predictions episode here, the final episode of the offseason. Next Monday, we're previewing the Baylor Bears game, and we are fully in to the regular season for this Gonzaga season. I cannot wait. First prediction was about Ryan Nembhard leading the country in assists. Second prediction here is that I think there's more NBA talent on this roster than people are giving credit for. And so the bold prediction here is that there are 4 players currently on Gonzaga's roster who will play in the NBA. And I want to say, hedging the bet a little bit here, it is specific to play in the NBA. I'm not saying there's 4 players on this roster who are going to be 5-year NBA vets, who are going to get second contracts, who are going to be key rotation players. 4 players on this roster who will make it into a game in the NBA. Again, guys like Zach Norvell and Joel Ajayi and Jonathan Williams and Elias Harris and others were guys who played less than 10, less than 15 games in the NBA, but we still count them as guys who were NBA players because they made it into the league. The second kind of part of this prediction, I'm sticking with the overall bold prediction just being 4 guys on this roster in the NBA. But the second kind of caveat is it's not going to be either of Gonzaga's 2 best players. The general consensus, and I agree with that consensus, is that 2 best players on Gonzaga's roster, the 2 best players in terms of production this upcoming season, will be Graham Ike and Ryan Nembhard. They are not among the players that I project to be NBA players going forward. And if you've listened to our player preview series, we're almost done with that. We got a couple more players we're going to combine into one episode later next week, but we've been talking about every player on this roster, and one of the last things we talk about in each of these episodes is their NBA future. With Ryan Nembhard and Graham Ike, they don't really fit the modern NBA. Ike because he is not a switchable defender and he's not a floor spacer as a big man. Nembhard because he is 6 feet tall. It is simply that. He's a great passer. The three-point shooting is lacking there, but even if he was a better three-point shooter, I'm not sure he would get a serious look simply because the NBA values size at every single position, including point guard. I also am not very confident in Nolan Hickman's ability to be an NBA player, not because of his talent level, but because, similarly to Nembhard, because of his size. He's a 6'3" 2 guard. That is one of the most dime-a-dozen type profiles in college basketball, and those guys really struggle to make it in the league. CJ McCollum is an extreme example of a player who the level of athleticism, the level of moving without the basketball, the level of scoring that you have to be a 2 guard under 6'4" in the modern NBA. It's very, very rare to make it. I'm not sure I see it with Hickman. So who is it going to be? Who are the 4 players on this roster who are going to be NBA players to make this prediction come true? Number 1 is the obvious one, Michael Ajayi. He's the only Zag currently projected in the upcoming NBA draft. He's projected on 2025 mock drafts on big boards that we've seen, and he was on them last year. A lot of people thought that he would end up declaring after his one and only season at Pepperdine, his one and only season playing Division I basketball, and he waited until the last possible minute. He hit the transfer portal right after the season, committed to Gonzaga pretty early in the transfer portal process, and then waited until June 29th, the last day that you could withdraw your name from the NBA draft, before deciding to come back to school and join Gonzaga for the upcoming season. And he waited that long to get as much feedback as he possibly could, and because there was still legitimate thought that he could be somebody who sneaks into the second round of the last NBA draft. Instead, he comes back to Gonzaga, where he's going to be in a system that looks much more like an NBA system than Pepperdine's, and he's going to be in a role that is much more conducive to the role he would fill in the NBA. Michael Ajayi averaged 17 points and 10 rebounds per game last year as Pepperdine's go-to scorer. They fed him the ball. They let him go to work. There wasn't a lot of teammates who could score on his team. He was forcing up a lot of shots at the end of the shot clock because they needed him to. That's not the role he's going to fill in the NBA. But at Gonzaga, as a floor spacer, as a third option, maybe fourth option offensively, as a rotation guy, role player type, that's more what he's going to be in the NBA. So it makes sense for him to play at Gonzaga. I think it's going to boost his draft stock. Obviously, every year you get older is a little bit of a knock for you. But for Ajayi, because there's just not a lot of tape on him, playing against quality opponents like Gonzaga will play in the non-conference, playing well, floor spacing, hitting open shots, cutting to the rim, playing better defensively than he did in Lorenzo Romar's system should allow him to be an NBA player. I feel very confident that Ajayi will play in the NBA. Whether that's because he gets drafted this year and signs a contract right away, whether it's because he gets a two-way contract, whatever it may be, I think Michael Ajayi is an NBA player, and I feel pretty confident that he's the most likely of this group to make it. Number 2 for me is Ben Gregg. Much less certain on Ben Gregg, but he's a 6'9" power forward who can defend the perimeter and who can shoot threes. 3-and-D is the key phrase in the modern NBA. It's what they want you to do. Can you defend your position? Can you be switchable defensively? And can you hit open threes? If you can do those things, you are going to make it in the NBA. Ben Gregg has pretty much proven that he can do that. And like Michael Ajayi, he has proven that he can adjust to being a role player. He's not somebody who, is a high usage player who always has the ball in his hands and puts up big numbers because of that. He's a low usage player who is efficient and effective when he does take shots, but doesn't need the ball in his hands to score. He can distribute the basketball adequately for his position. He hits open threes. He can score around the rim, and he's proven himself a capable defender in space. He still needs to improve in that area, and I think that's a big hinge for him. I'm not sure I see Ben Gregg being drafted, but I think he could put up a quality season here, doing a little bit of everything, being that versatile, do-it-all type forward, and NBA teams will take notice. He'll get an invite to Summer League, and he'll hit open threes and defend his position, and scouts and GMs will be like, hey, we really like this guy. We want to keep him around. And I think I could see him getting a chance where he does end up playing in the NBA. Again, I don't know if he sticks, but I could see him making it. Next one is definitely the biggest wild card on the group here. And I don't want to, it's not cheating because the prediction is 4 players on this roster end up playing in the NBA. Not 4 players in this rotation, 4 players on this roster. So for number 3, I'm going with Ismaila Diagne, Gonzaga's freshly 18-year-old backup center, third string center, really a guy that they signed from overseas earlier in the offseason, a player who's going to play very little this season. And he's looked incredibly raw. He looked incredibly raw against USC. Frankly, he was the only player who looked raw and not very good in his short spurts of action against Warner Pacific in that exhibition game. He's really raw, and it's going to take him time. It's not going to happen this year. But he is so big. Again, I mentioned this in a recent episode. If you've seen Gonzaga's picture, like their team photo this year, Ismaila Diagne looks massive. He looks much bigger than Graham Ike. He is a really big dude. He's strong. He's physical. He looks like he can develop into a very good rim protector, and he's got offensive versatility. He showed that during his time coming up in Spain. He's a player that I think, again, some people had him on 2026 NBA draft boards before he even came to Gonzaga. At this point, he does not look like somebody who's going to do enough this year or even next year to be an NBA player, but his youth, his size, the fact that he came up in a very promising system in Europe, the fact that Gonzaga bigs develop at a really high hit rate, I'm a big believer that Ismaila Diagne is an NBA player eventually. He's just much farther away than anybody else on this roster right now. And at that point, then, if we feel those 3 guys are making the NBA, we just need one more player on this roster to make it. And there's a handful of options. Braden Huff's not ready right now, but if he develops better defensively, he's 6'10", he can shoot the 3. He's got a really nice looking shot. If he becomes closer to a 38, 40% three-point shooter, still need the defense to improve, but there's a possibility there. Dusty Stromer is your prototypical 3-and-D wing. He needs to get stronger. He needs to become a better decision maker offensively, a little bit more aggressive, but he's very young. And the fact that he's already a good defender for his position and shot 41% down the stretch last year clearly points to a player who has the requisite skills to be a modern NBA player. Caleb Battle, age is working against him in a major way, and he's not a three-point shooter in the way that you'd want a player at 6'5" to be, but he's a tremendous at putting pressure on the rim, elite at getting to the free throw line, elite at converting. That alone should get him looks. He's the kind of guy that I could see signing on to a summer league team and scoring like 27 points a game in the summer league, and everybody's like, what in the heck is going on there? And then he gets a look. He actually reminds me a little bit of Ricky Council, who also played at Arkansas, was there a couple of years ago, and balled out in summer league and has now gotten some opportunities to play in the NBA. And again, on the roster, so it counts, Braden Smith is a player we haven't seen yet. He's been compared to Ryan Nembhard a lot. He was very productive at Colgate in the Patriot League. He's about 3 inches taller than Ryan Nembhard. If he can be that kind of explosive athlete, explosive point guard where he's distributing the ball, 6-7 assists per game, shooting well from three, and he's 6'3", maybe he gets a look as well. All right, we got one more. It's fun, it's exciting, it's thrilling, it's potentially heartbreaking. It's the final bold prediction for this season. We're going to talk about how far we think these Zags might advance in March. But first, let's talk about FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the college hoops action this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to know to place live bets all in one place. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place those bets. Gonzaga opens the season 3.5-point favorites against the Baylor Bears in the Spokane Arena on November 4th. I like the Zags to cover. I think this is going to be a close game, but if it's a 3-4 point game towards the end and Baylor's putting fouls on Caleb Battle, it's going to end up being a 7-8 point game. That's why I like these odds for Gonzaga. If you agree, visit FanDuel.com to join today. And like I said, you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if that first bet is a win. FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, closing out the show, closing out the week, closing out October, although closing out really the 1st of November, and frankly, closing out the offseason with our final bold prediction going into the 2024-25 college basketball season. It's that Gonzaga is going to make the national championship game. And it's not just that, it's who they're going to play. I have Gonzaga in a 25-year-old rematch of their first run to the Elite Eight, that magical 1999 season under Dan Munson, when they took down the Florida Gators to go to the Elite Eight. The slipper still fits, the iconic Gus Johnson call that has been synonymous with Gonzaga basketball for literally 2 decades. It is a rematch. Give me Gonzaga, Florida, Mark Few, Todd Golden. We're going to party like it's 1999. That is my prediction for the national championship matchup going into the season. Why the Zags will make it. This team was one of the best teams in the country down the stretch last year, and everybody's back. Obviously not everybody. Anton Watson is a key departure, and I don't want to just gloss over that. We have spent a lot of time this offseason talking about the loss of Anton Watson in terms of Gonzaga's perimeter defense and just having his kind of jackknife utility talents on this roster. But continuity for this team is incredible. 7 of their 8 rotation players from last year are back. And they add in a very, very good forward in Michael Ajayi. He's not the defender that Anton Watson is, but he's a better floor spacer. He's a very talented scorer, and he's a better rebounder than Anton Watson. And then you effectively replace Luka Krajinovic with Caleb Battle. No disrespect to Luka. I liked him. He was a really good kid, and I think he could have developed into a very quality player. But Caleb Battle is a fifth-year veteran. He's a 15-point-per-game scorer last year in the SEC. He is a dynamic, fluid player who brings to Gonzaga something they've not really had in a long time, in his ability to get to the rim, get to the free throw line, put that kind of pressure on opposing defenses. To have 2 really fantastic new additions, veteran players who are ready to help this team win right away, while also returning 7 players from a team that looked like one of the 5 best teams in college basketball in the last half of last season. That's why I have this team projected as high as I do. Outside of that, Dusty Stromer's going to be better than he was last year. Braden Huff, we hope, will be better. He looked a little rough in the USC exhibition game, but we're not trying to glean too much from that performance. He's somebody who, if he's better in that backup role, that's really valuable for this team. You got some valuable depth in a player like Emmanuel Innocente, who could have transferred to other quality programs and played real minutes right away, but instead will be probably the 9th or 10th man on this team. Defense is a bit of a concern. I'll say that. I believe that is something that could trip up this Gonzaga team, but it will improve as the season goes on. And they're going to be battle tested with a very strong non-conference schedule. Why Florida will make it. Todd Golden is great at developing guards. He is a guard whisperer. This team gets 2 crucial guards back from last year's roster, and Walter Clayton and Will Riley, both veterans, both SEC guys last year with Florida. They're experienced. They're familiar with the team, familiar with the system. They also add Elijah Martin from FAU. Martin was the second best player on that FAU team that went to the Final Four 2 years ago, and that was really good last year. Adding him with those 2 guards gives them the most, I think, the deepest backcourt in the entire SEC. They also have a potential breakout candidate in the front court in Alex Condon. Last year, he averaged 7.7 points, 6.4 boards, and 1.3 blocks. That was in 20 minutes per game. He was a usage monster. It's Donovan Clingan light. He's not as big as Clingan. He's not as impactful defensively as Clingan, but almost 8 points and 6.5 rebounds in 20 minutes per game is incredibly effective. They also add another player who's very similar in the sense that he was highly effective in a small role, and that's Ruben Chinyelu, who transferred from Washington State, 6'11", 245 pounds. He's a monstrous dude, 4.7 points, 5 rebounds, 1.3 blocks. Folks, that was in 14 minutes per game. They have 2 low usage or low minute, highly efficient monsters in the front court. They have 2 veteran guards who are familiar with the system in Clayton and Riley. They have a wild card, super athlete veteran addition in Elijah Martin. And then Micah Hanlogton was their best big man last year. He's got a significant injury. He's going to miss part of the year, but if he's back and healthy by the time they get into the NCAA tournament into March, this is going to be a really good team. Florida's projected 7th or 8th in the SEC, so projecting them to make the national championship is far bolder than it is to project Gonzaga is going to make the national championship. I will admit that. That is far and away the boldest part of any of these projections is Florida making the national championship. But how fun would it be to see Gonzaga get their 3rd opportunity in a national championship game, squaring off against the team where they beat and started it all 25 years ago in 1999, against a coach who they've played against many times in Todd Golden from his time at San Francisco. It's a potential incredible storyline. I would love it. I'll admit that I'm just wanting this to happen, but there's definitely reason to believe that this Florida team is being underrated and underappreciated coming into the season. And certainly Gonzaga is going to be a lot of people's pick to be in that national championship game. Why not pair them with a team nobody's expecting, see if we can get some fun fireworks and potentially bring home that national championship trophy to Spokane and really finally get Mark Few. What a year it would be for Mark Few, win a gold medal, bring home a national championship, all in like a 8-month span. Could be some of the best times in Gonzaga basketball history if these predictions are able to come true. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much. For those of you who've been with me throughout the offseason, who are so excited that we're going to be previewing games, reviewing games, getting into the actual basketball side of things, I want to thank all of you so much. I had a blast this offseason. I love off-season content. I really do. I don't get bored of it. I don't get sick of it. But man, I am ready to watch some real basketball games next week too. And I'm sure you are all as well. I hope you'll have a fantastic, if not a little bit anxiety-riddled weekend as we get ready for that big-time game on Monday against the Baylor Bears. It's going to be a fantastic one. Looking forward to it. Thanks again for listening, folks. And until next time, as always, now more than ever, go Zags.